Web Marketing That Works podcast, episode number 47, where we discuss the Seth Godin Day in Sydney.
Welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. Come behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments and listen in as amazing guests confess the truth about what really works. Now, here are your hosts, Adam Franklin and Toby Jenkins.
Hey there, it's Adam Franklin from the Web Marketing That Works podcast, and joined by my co-host, Toby Jenkins. Hey, Tobes.
Hey, Ads. How you going?
Good. What a fantastic day at Seth Godin yesterday.
It was amazing, wasn't it? It was, so thought-provoking and interesting. It was incredible. Looking forward to debriefing.
Yeah, so this episode we'll talk all about it, but before we get there, this is the show for people who love marketing on the web. You'll be taken behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments. We'll look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. We confess what's failed and reveal the truth about what really works.
So the show is brought to you by our bonus 33 free templates that come with the book Web Marketing That Works. Those templates are available from bluewiremedia.com.au/book. So go and jump on over there and help yourself.
And a big shout out to Barry Devlin from Perfect Day Weddings, who left us a 5-star review on iTunes. Thanks for listening in, Barry, and thanks for the feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Barry.
Okay, so Tobes, we've followed Seth Godin for many, many years. We consider him one of the best marketing mentors via his blog and his books on the planet, and a real thrill when we discovered on his blog late last year that he'd be coming out to Australia. And I think a lot of people actually might have even missed that blog post because it was right before Christmas. Most people would have been on holiday. I remember we were editing our book, so we were at our computer 10 hours a day at least.
Looking for any excuse at that stage.
Yeah, so we were lucky enough to see it on his blog. And of course, with Seth's following and reputation, he doesn't need to do a whole lot of selling to get people to come to his event. So we actually bought the tickets back then, and from talking with other friends and business owners, it seems like a few people didn't know that he'd be coming to town. So what we wanted to do today is actually just talk through some of the take-home things that we learned, and really, I guess, share what it was like to spend a day with Seth.
Yeah, with the great man. I mean, one of the things, I guess, walking into the day was just that the agenda was that it was a day of Q&A, which was pretty loose, so I didn't really know what to expect. My primary goal for the day was just to see the guy on stage and hear what he had to say. But then there was just so much more to it, and to be honest, it was an incredible format, I thought.
Yeah, it was really good. He could get to the bottom of a lot of the individual questions that people had, and he also had he did have slides and a rough framework that he took us through, and then there was so much time throughout the day for the Q&A. And of course, if people had questions on their mind, then chances are heaps of other people in the audience were thinking that as well. So it was really opened up a lot of different discussions, which I found incredibly valuable.
So Seth basically started off the day and he said he wanted to introduce 3 sort of core concepts that was, I guess, a seed to get people starting to think, get the juices flowing, and to inspire questions. And so he kicked off with a probably 15, 20-minute presentation. And the sort of 3 key aspects that he spoke about was a concept that he came back to time and time again throughout the day, that people like us do things like this. So the second was, what change are you trying to make in your customers? And the third was this idea of an empresario. So perhaps if we go back to that first one, Ads, people like us do things like this. To me, he was sort of talking as a foundational sort of concept for his tribes that he's written a lot about, creating tribes that people like you and me who spend our time podcasting, writing blog posts. Then you understand the actions and therefore can sort of connect with them through those actions. What was your interpretation of that?
Yeah, my interpretation of people like us do things like this was basically, as a marketer or as a business leader or leader in general, that it's all about that story, that narrative that you create for people, so that whether it's Apple fans buying an Apple product or a certain type of CEO buying consulting services, or even a child buying, stuff to play around with at the schoolyard, that every product and every service and business has a narrative that goes with it. And what you're basically trying to say is the message or the story is that, yeah, people like us do things like that. And so people are either buying into your story or they're not, but it's a clear line in the sand, and it helps clarify in the customer but also the business that you have people who are in or they're basically in or they're out. You shouldn't be trying to convince people who don't buy into the story. You can save all that time of convincing non-believers, but you can focus your time on the people who do buy into the story and who do buy into that narrative. And he gave examples of big business like Tiffany and the whole story, the whole narrative of the blue box. If that part of the story is worthwhile to you, then you're more than happy to pay the premium for buying that brand name. But if you're more interested in just the jewelry itself and you don't necessarily buy into that narrative, then you don't need to be spending that money. But basically, people like us do things like this. So if you are in that, if you do believe in that story, then you go down the Tiffany path. Or if you do believe in the McKinsey consulting story, then you can. And he gave a whole heap of different examples. And for us, and us being part of Seth's tribe, even though he says he doesn't own the tribe, but he provides a narrative for it. People like us like to see people like Seth, and it doesn't necessarily matter what the price point's at because we buy into his story. And I think as a business and as a marketer, creating that narrative and understanding what you and your customers do believe in and don't believe in helps with the whole storytelling that goes around the marketing, was my interpretation.
Yeah, and I mean, he did give some other great examples. One that I particularly liked was his story about the odd socks. And so he gave that story you were talking about, young girls talking in a schoolyard, and he spoke about the fact that someone came up with this idea of having odd socks where you bought 3 in a pack and all of them were different. And the idea was that the girls would show up to school and share the story of why they're wearing odd socks. And basically, and in fact, to this day, Seth, since he's heard that story, wears odd socks, which was pretty funny when he lifted up his trouser legs and showed us his odd socks on stage. But that to me was kind of a great example of, a product that people were going, that the children were going to talk about in the schoolyard, and that, people like us, people who like to wear odd socks, or people who, these kids who wanted to talk about this stuff did wear things like odd socks. And so, they spoke about it in the schoolyard, and therefore it was more likely to be talked about at home, and the kids would say, hey, I want a pair of these odd socks as well. And, that whole story was then told for the sock manufacturer as opposed to having to try to tell people about your socks. The customer does the storytelling, and I think that was a really interesting idea. And I totally agree with you, that inclusion-exclusion point. He talked about that with tribes as being, if you don't have outsiders, you can't actually have a tribe, which is a really interesting idea. And, that Harley Davidson was his example there, where he said, initially these people came together around Harley Davidson's being disrespected, and what Harley gave to them as disrespected outsiders, they came together around Harley Davidson, and Harley Davidson allowed them to be respected insiders of Harley Davidson Motorcycle Group. And so it put people together, and that's why the Harley Davidson story and the business and the following that they've built is so passionate about the business itself as well, and the brand. So that was, that was a great example for me of that inclusion, actually taking people who had previously felt excluded and making them feel included, and therefore you've got a passionate, really dedicated following.
And giving people that, allowing people to tell that story themselves and to be belonging into that narrative and that story is such an important part of what Seth was talking about. And that was tying into part 2, right, of what change are you trying to make in your customers?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and that is exactly. So the change Harley was trying to make in that example was to give these disrespected outsiders an opportunity to be an insider with Harley Davidson. And so that was, they changed they made that change in the customer, so then they felt included, potentially for not the first time perhaps, but certainly, one of the rare occasions where otherwise society had treated them otherwise.
And to build on that, Seth was explaining that creating that narrative has contributed to Harley-Davidson being so successful, not because of their huge market share, but because the tribe that they do have is so passionate, and to translate that into how we might use that in our own marketing, or how people listening to the show might apply that to their own marketing. He said, you need to be clear on, I'm trying to change this type of person, and be clear on this type of person and change them in this way. And so in your Harley-Davidson example, I'm trying to change these people that feel like disrespected outsiders, and trying to change them in this way, make them feel like an included insider.
Mm.
And Apple, he gave that example as well of how Steve Jobs allowed people, he gave people the option for good taste with digital media, and for us to be able to think about our ideal customers, or the people we want to influence, and then how we're going to help them change, is such a powerful underlying story with all the marketing and business.
It really tied in, I thought, nicely with the story we've heard elsewhere about Apple, which is Apple has a 7% market share, and yet a 75%, in terms of volume, they have a 77% of the volume of the market, but they have like 75 or 85% of the profits of the market.
Right.
And to me, that is like a great example of, if you build a tribe who really loves your stuff and is passionate about it because it defines something much more than just using a computer, in Apple's example, then you have people who will spend a premium for one, and they will buy every single product that you make, because they're defining themselves by it, as opposed to just the utility value of a computer or a phone or a music playing device. It's part of how they see themselves.
And Harley-Davidson, right? They're spending $30,000 on a bike and tattooing their name to their body half the time. But it's a very powerful,
if someone tattoos their logo on your body, you've figured out your tribe pretty well, I reckon.
Totally.
Mm.
Should we move on to the empresarios, and that idea of empresarios don't wait to be picked, they put on a show? And I guess if you're listening and you are familiar with Seth's work, then the language and vernacular like tribes and everything else that we're talking about, and being an artist, you'll be quite familiar with it. But if you're not as familiar with Seth's, and some of the vernacular doesn't quite sound as normal as you're used to, then certainly forgive us if we butcher some of Seth's
absolutely,
Seth's notions. But we're really trying to sort of explain the take-homes that we got from it, and relay it in a way that hopefully has value to you.
Yeah. The impresario idea that he put forward was, to me, picking yourself, having a go, and being prepared to fail. He told the story about a guy who was trying to take Elvis on tour, who rang Elvis's manager every day for a year, and then gave up, and then Elvis's manager needed the cash, so he called him back 6 months later and decided he would go ahead with this tour, and to make sure that it was going to work. And anyway, there's some great detail around the story that I'm probably not equipped to tell really at this stage of the game. But to me, Seth is an impresario himself as well, in that he has blogged every single day for a very long time, and he's just had a crack at it and got better and better and better at it. And he talks about the fact that he wants to fail a lot. And I guess in failing, learn what will work as well, and so that to me is a part of the impresario, is have a go, make something happen, and then keep that dichotomy that he was talking about, which is this might work or this might not work, and being comfortable with that tension between those two, but ultimately having a go first and seeing what happens.
Yeah, his philosophy was, if I can fail more than anybody else, then I win. Because the more you fail, the more you learn, and the better you can become. And he has done a lot of risky projects over the years. He was saying some have paid off well, some haven't been quite as successful as maybe he'd hoped. But the important part is that you're always trying new things, and you're always pushing yourself and pushing your comfort zone, so that you are on that edge where you're not sure. There's no guarantee if it's going to work, because that's when you do the work that actually matters the most.
Yeah. Was there more you wanted to sort of share on the empresario?
No, I was happy to move through to the tactics.
Sure. So, yeah, the couple of points that he made as well around the tactic side of things was attention is precious, it's finite, and that our choice is approaching infinity for so much of what we buy and see and read and look at and where we spend our money. And
that's actually changed a lot in the last 15 years with the internet. There used to be 3 TV channels. Now there's millions of YouTube channels. And the bookstore with a certain number of titles on the shelf. Now there's Amazon with every single book ever published, all available at one click of a button. So the choice is, approaching infinity.
Yeah, it's actually, it's pretty crazy to think that has happened in such a short period of time, really. So he talks about because attention is precious and becoming more and more precious, that is now the scarce resource. As opposed to in your book example, once upon a time it was the shelf space in a bookstore that was precious. Now that shelf space has been made completely redundant. It's no longer scarce because Amazon has has an enormous amount of choice, and shelf space is not the scarce resource that it once was. And so the asset then becomes permission. And I know we've spoken about it a ton on this show, primarily driven by Seth's thinking and enormously influenced by the likes of him. And so what's your return on attention was one of Seth's phrases yesterday, which I really liked as well.
And with that attention then comes that opportunity to build permission, which is the real asset that you're building online. And he gave an interesting story, or a hypothetical story of if you were looking to marry somebody, would you go straight into a singles bar and ask every single woman that you met, will you marry me? And if they said no, would you then go on to every other girl in the bar and ask them if you'd marry them? And of course you wouldn't, because that's much too big a jump to take. There's no trust. Even if it's the right girl who you're meant to marry, if you ask her the very first time you meet her, you're going to get rejected. But so he says, why are we as marketers trying to marry people as soon as we meet them? There's got to be this courting process in for getting to know you and getting to build that trust, where you build that trust, which builds that permission and that asset that you've got permission to communicate with people on an ongoing basis. And really the real test of whether you do have someone's permission is, would they miss you if you fail to show up tomorrow? So would they miss your email newsletter if it didn't come, or would they miss your podcast or your YouTube video series if you stop doing it? Which I think is a really fair and accurate assessment of whether or not the work you're producing is actually of a high enough standard, and would people miss you if you didn't do it?
Yeah, it's a great question to ask yourself, and for us to ask ourselves too, and each and every time we're pushing stuff out too. So, the other part of it that I really liked about this idea of permission that he spoke about was also, he made the point that permission is not a right but a privilege, and that and I guess that ties back into is the work. Would people actually miss your work? And so you need to treat it as a privilege and really make sure that you've got that commitment from yourself to earn the trust and continue to be entitled to that, or not entitled to the trust, but have the privilege of that trust from people, because attention is so scarce. And in actual fact, he said, then once you have that trust, his next point was, how do you move permission to connection, which was an interesting one too.
Because with that permission, really once you've got that ability to communicate with people in your audience, for lack of a better word, then you've got the opportunity to find products for those people, which is the reverse way of doing it that typically people do, which is build a product and then find people to buy it. Whereas if you've got that permission and that trust and that audience of people, they trust you. So if you can find products that they need and that they want to buy, then that's a much easier way and a much more profitable and sustainable way to run a business than building something and going out of your way to interrupt people and coerce them and cajole them into actually buying something from you. Mm-hmm. So with that permission and that trust, then you've got this huge opportunity to grow your business out from there.
Yeah.
One of the quotes I particularly liked from Seth was that the the purpose of social media like Facebook and Twitter and everything else is really to earn the trust, earn that permission so that you can talk to people or start by whispering to people. And from there, that scales, and generosity scales. And if you can help more people, then you're introducing a whole lot of value into the community that you serve. And because ideas scale, valuable ideas that you're sharing with people generously, that leads to trust. And eventually, from a way to commercialize what you're doing on the web and with social media, all the way through to dollars, if you're running a business or you're marketing a business, then the more you can be generous, eventually the right people are going to gravitate to you, and then people will eventually put their hand up and say, I want you to do work for me, I want you to do this for me, and not just the free stuff that I've got access to on the web, but I want you as a person or you as a company, because there's only one you, or there's only one of your companies that can do this, that truly understands what I'm about. And that's how all the stuff that you do in social media and the web translates back to business outcomes. For example, when Seth released his book, The Idea Virus, which was interesting because that's when we first discovered Seth. I remember I signed up to something on his website, or I'd been forwarded an email which had the entire digital copy of Idea Virus totally for free. I got that in my inbox, and that was my first interaction with Seth. That was many, many years ago now. And subsequently I signed up. I've even got the hard copy of the book sitting on a bookshelf. So he gave the digital copy away for free, and then a month later actually introduced the hard copy to the marketplace at a higher price point, like $40, and it sold huge volumes of copy. It was a bestseller. But subsequently, because he put so much free, valuable stuff into the marketplace, not only did the book sell really well, the hard copy book, but he then tripled his speaker fee and was able to reach way more people and got way more speaking gigs because people knew him and knew what he was about and felt like he was part of the family, so they wanted to hear from him. So that was just Seth's personal anecdote of how ideas scale and how that leads to trust and business outcomes in the end as well. How about you, Toby? You actually got to ask Seth a question.
Yeah, so it was really cool to have the chance to ask Seth a question, and that was the whole day anyway. So he'd just been speaking about how he challenges himself to try to get thrown out of the village, which is his way of saying, how do I challenge the status quo? How do I sort of cause a bit of a ruckus, basically, and do something different and do something that matters? Because his belief is that things that matter are the things that you really can't be sure of, and the village might throw you out for. So he tries to push himself to do that each time. And so my question to him was, how do you hold yourself accountable to keep trying to get yourself thrown out of the village? And he had a really interesting answer to that, and that was basically he looked for two things. The first component of it was he holds himself accountable by writing down his ideas, which I found fascinating as an idea. His entire backlog of his blog then keeps him accountable because he's written it down. Other people can reference it. He can reference it, and therefore he needs to be able to stand by it or defend it, or also keep inspiring himself and the feedback from others in that process. And the other people who he can help in the process is a really big inspiration for him. And then the other part of it was he said he looked for supportive and honest people. And he said that is a really difficult thing to find, is someone who is supportive in that, yes, keep pushing the boundaries, keep trying to do something that's fresh and new and, that works and will make a difference and do work that matters, but equally someone who's prepared to give you honest feedback, not just bash an idea, not just pump your tires and tell you how good you are. So it was that sort of balance between supportive and honest people. And he said there's only a handful of those people that he's found. So he looks to those people as external, and then internally he uses his blog to keep himself on that track of trying to do work that matters all the time, which I thought was just a nice little way of treating the feedback loop and the goal of making a difference. So that was cool.
And because certain blog posts and certain books that he writes get a lot more feedback and from readers saying, well, this has had this impact on my life, and the more he gets of those types of ones, the more he feels like he's making an impact on the world. And I think he said, for example, Meatball Sunday was a great book and he was proud of it and everything, but it didn't have the same kind of impact as Linchpin or Tribes based on the feedback from his actual readers. And that's how he gauges, just to build on your answer, your chat there, Tobes, was that's how he gauges how well he's doing, and that's how he holds himself accountable. I just wanted to give an example of getting thrown out of the village to give it some more context, because Seth said that he was kicked out by the Direct Marketers Association of America. For 10 years. They wouldn't have a bar of him, and they they figuratively threw him out of the organisation. And yet 10 years after that had happened, he was made one of 3 members of their Hall of Fame, because they'd finally come round to embracing his way of thinking. But at the start, it was far too out of their box for them that they rejected it, and they rejected him. So Seth himself has been thrown out of the village, so to speak, and they've re-embraced him, or let him come back in all these years later.
Yeah, actually, just another point on yours there, Ads, as well, in that Seth holds himself to how much change he's been able to create with his work, was that he stopped reading all of his 1-star reviews, say, on Amazon, or any review of his work, because he said there was just nothing to gain from it. But he also felt as though if he wasn't going to read the 1-star reviews, then he wasn't entitled to read the 5-star reviews either. And then in that process, he said, so the only thing that matters to my work now is not what the critics say and what people say about it, but whether or not people write in to tell him, yes, this has changed my way of thinking, this has changed my world in this way. And those sorts of comments is how he gauges the success or failure of any given piece of work.
That has had some real impact with a person, as opposed to just a positive or a negative review.
Yes, yeah.
He said, no great writer or thinker that he'd spoken about had ever got any real value, had not made their work better by reading 1-star reviews on Amazon. So he decided he wouldn't. And he spent ages, many years, reading the negative reviews, and it would rattle him, he said. And then once he realised that other great writers, it didn't improve their writing, so why bother reading them? And if you can't read the 1s, then you shouldn't read the 5s. So just get on with the work and focus on the impact you're having with people. It was just actually a couple more points to round out the podcast of things that I took out of, some of the key things that I took out of the day. And one of the questions that somebody posed was, well, what do you do about piracy and people plagiarizing your ideas and everything on the web? And he said, well, that's not a problem, because if people are doing that, they're spreading the word for you, all the things that are great about social media. But he said the enemy isn't piracy. The enemy is obscurity. So it's having people share your stuff means you're doing something well, and they want to copy it. They want to claim it as their own. They want to be stealing it. That's great, really, because it's so much better than being obscure and putting stuff out there and no one interacting with it, it resonating with nobody, and then you're basically forgotten. So if people are stealing and pirating and plagiarizing your work, don't worry so much about it. Treat it as a good thing, which I personally thought was a really nice take home, and an encouragement for sharing your best thinking online and letting it spread. And he said, let other people take credit for your work. If you're truly doing good stuff, then share it out there. Good ideas spread, good ideas scale, and sure, let other people take credit for it, because at least that way that thinking and those ideas are getting traction.
And if that particular question as well was in the context of a kitchen appliance and the questioner was a bit worried that, someone like Samsung might come along and take the idea and run with it. And Seth's comment to that was, well, Samsung is not short of ideas. These big guys, which I think is, a fairly common fear. And Seth's experience was that the big guys are not short of ideas by any stretch of the imagination. They're just trying to figure out which idea they're going to go with of their own. And so to put your own out there and start to build a tribe around your own idea and what you'd like to accomplish with it, he basically said, just go ballistic. And the sooner you get started, the better.
Well, that were the major take-homes from an action-packed day with Seth. There was plenty more that we covered, and we couldn't hope to do it all justice. But certainly talking through that has covered off a lot of the points that I wanted to share, Toby.
Yeah, it was a great day, Ads. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Huge thanks to Seth for what must have been an extremely demanding day of thinking on your feet from 9 o'clock in the morning till 4:30 in the afternoon. He did awesome work, and it was great to be a part of the audience to hear out his and even just to watch his thinking and how he sort of structured his answers. I thought was really interesting too.
Yeah, it was definitely fun to witness that all, and he hasn't been to Australia before, I think. And he said it was unlikely that he'd be back anytime soon. Not in a way that Australia's bad, but it's just a long way to come. And he's obviously got a lot on his plate over back home in New York. But also thank you to Bernadette Jiwa, who hosted the day and is friends and colleagues with Seth, and she's based over in Perth. So
yeah, thanks very much, Bernadette,
for helping get Seth over. That was fantastic. So that wraps up our debrief of the Seth Godin Day. This show was brought to you by our book called Web Marketing That Works and the bonus 33 free templates that go with it. And you can get your hands on those at bluewiremedia.com.au/book. The intent, as always, is to deliver actionable advice, and your feedback and questions are welcome. Please let us know via email or Twitter. I'm adam.franklin@bluewiremedia.com.au.
And I'm Toby Jenkins. Toby.Jenkins@bluewiremedia.com.au or Toby_Jenkins on Twitter. If you've enjoyed the show, we'd love you to leave an honest review on iTunes. So thanks very much, everyone.
We'll see you next time.